All right, our speaker today is Dr. Matt Hayes. It's not Hughes, Hayes, an avid birder since the year 2000. He's our current assistant director for the Illinois Audubon Society. He has a PhD. He's prepared in field ornithology and is a geneticist and has conducted research on the handhill cranes in Wisconsin for over 15 years. He also does research on piping plovers and many songbirds. Prior to coming to Audubon in 2022, he was a professor teaching ornithology at the University of Illinois, Springfield. Today, however, he's going to be speaking on Woodpeckers of Illinois, and I'm pleased to introduce to you Dr. Matt Hayes.
Thanks so much, Marilyn. I appreciate it. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm excited to kind of kick off the first virtual meeting we've had for Springfield Audubon. I will say this is a fairly new presentation, so I ask for patience, but I think it's going to be good. And kind of what got me interested, let me get my screen up here. I'm going to get my screen sharing going here. And what really kind of interested me in this presentation or this overall topic was, we see woodpeckers all the time, and they're very common in the backyards, but how much do we really know about them? And so we just kind of wanted to dig a little bit deeper, and as I kind of got into it, it kind of became more and more fascinating. So I'm going to kind of do an introduction into how do we define a woodpecker and what are their relatives in terms of what we know genetically. Some special adaptations that they have to be able to do the job that they do and kind of define what that job is. And then I'm going to talk about the woodpeckers that we have here in Illinois that you very likely see in your backyard, at least from time to time. So in terms of woodpeckers as a species, they belong to the order Piciformes. And with birds, when we talk about bird orders, we're talking about kind of a large group of species that have a shared genetic history. And the Piciformes, its name actually comes from the Roman forest god Picus, who, according to myth, was turned into a woodpecker by the sorceress Circe when he actually spurned her amorous advances. So I found that interesting because Picus or Pica actually refers generally to woodpecker. So Piciformes is in the form of a woodpecker. They're found worldwide. There are 6 different families within woodpecker order. And this includes the puffbirds, the parbits, toucans, surprisingly, which maybe some folks didn't think about, honey guides, as well as woodpeckers. And so just kind of a gallery of some representative species. We've got in the upper left here, we've got the great spotted woodpecker. Below that is kind of the infamous or well-known kind of Toko toucan. If you were a kid like me growing up, Toucan Sam for Fruit Loops. This is the iconic bird species. Below that, we have the crested barbet. Kind of looks a little bit like a northern cardinal that's gone a little bit punk rock with its crest there. Below that is the blue-throated barbet. So the barbets are a couple of species that are fairly large in terms of the number of species found. And then on the right-hand column at the very top, we have the yellow-rumped honey guide. Honey guides are really cool. If you took one of the quizzes that I made at the end of last year, we kind of learned that honey guides actually work really well with human species over in Africa and are used by humans to guide people to honey hives or beehives. Humans benefit because they can extract the honey, and then the honey guides benefit because they get the larvae of the bees. It's really kind of an interesting situation. Below that is a species called the toucan barbet, the Guinean puffbird, and then the coppery-chested jacamar is at the very bottom right, which looks a lot like a hummingbird, but surprisingly, they don't extract nectar like hummingbirds do. They actually use that bill to locate insects and larvae and use that for collecting food in terms of insects. So really kind of interesting. In terms of family, the Piccaday, which includes the woodpeckers, sapsuckers, and flickers. There's 241 species in 36 genera. They're found everywhere on the planet except for Australia, Madagascar, and Antarctica. And then here in North America, North and Central America, we have 56 species in 12 genera. So I'm a science geek. I use genetics, or did in the past, to look at a variety of different aspects. And I really like looking at kind of these phylogenetic trees. And yes, this is a bit of a hot mess. Looks like a kind of a plate of colored spaghetti. But what you want to focus on are in the yellow here, the group called the Afroaves. It's kind of a subclass underneath Aves, which is the bird class. And I highlighted the Piciformes, so they are a member of this group. And when you kind of look at their relationships, it includes some of the maybe more well-known species like the toucans. It includes things like kingfishers and the kookaburra of Australia. Hornbills are part of this overall group, trogons. And then kind of as an outside, but still included within this clade, are the hawks, vultures, as well as the owls. So it's really kind of an interesting loose grouping, but they all have a shared common ancestor. And this was work done by Stiller and others in 2024, and they did a lot with looking at genome-wide similarities amongst a lot of different species. All right. So in terms of woodpecker natural history, I mean, aside from being really cool, they've also got a really important role in the overall ecological health, as well as importance for other species around them. As you might expect, they're found typically in forests, woodlands, and savannas, and they're what are considered an obligate cavity nester. They need those cavities to nest, they need them to roost, and they utilize those cavities throughout their entire annual cycle. And they're also a species that are considered a keystone and ecosystem engineer because they excavate those cavities themselves. They're what's called a primary cavity excavator. Makes sense, they're a woodpecker. But what's also important is after they excavate these cavities, they may use them again, they may excavate a new cavity. They also excavate areas in order to forage. But what's really important is that there are a number of species that utilize those cavities after woodpeckers have kind of abandoned them. This includes things like wood ducks, common goldeneye, flying squirrels, as this little cute guy is in the picture, eastern screech owls, great crested flycatchers, and many, many others. So that makes them a nice keystone species, as well as an ecosystem engineer, because their normal niche, their normal daily lives, what they go about doing, creates habitat for a variety of other species. In addition to that, they're also considered an ecosystem engineer because they help continue and foster the process of dead and dying trees being broken down and those nutrients getting put back into the soil. So they've been shown to increase the rate of dead tree decomposition. They do this mechanically, as the center picture kind of shows, by drilling these cavities and these large holes into a variety of different trees. They also do things that you might not think of, like spreading wood fungus or wood decaying fungus around. Wood-boring insects get thrown all over the place as they're pecking these holes into these trunks of trees. They also inoculate these wood decaying fungus, making them active so that the wood tissue and wood pulp can be broken down. And you can see on the upper right, this is actually a dead tree that ended up falling over. It was covered in carpenter ants, and it actually had a huge number of woodpecker holes in there. So the woodpeckers had been feasting on the ants, but the ants are also utilizing the trunk of the tree for their house. And it just kind of helps to continue the process of breaking down these dead and dying trees so that they're part of the overall healthy ecosystem. And then lastly, a variety of woodpecker species also cache food. So they store food for themselves, for periods when food is going to be scarce, so the winter or the dry season. This is an acorn woodpecker in the lower right. These guys are found further west of Illinois. But you can see meticulous hole drilling that is all perfectly sized for these acorns that they are going to stuff into these little cavities. They utilize it for food sources. Other species utilize it for food sources. And then when a tree breaks down and the acorns are still present, those will also regenerate those seeds and get them planted so that the forest can continue to regenerate. Really, really kind of cool as I dug into kind of the history of these guys. So, as we all know, woodpecker species peck wood. You guys hear them in your backyard. You might hear them on your house occasionally, unfortunately. But what's really, really interesting is when you slow down that pecking, it looks incredibly, it's crazy. So let me show you. This is a slow down series of a great spotted woodpecker found in Europe and Asia. And I don't know how many frames per second this is, but it will show you the sheer force that these birds go through as they are pecking into the wood. Look at its whole body shake and shimmy. Look at the feathers. It's just crazy. And we're interested in this kind of stuff from an ecological and a behavioral perspective. But a really kind of interesting is that humans have also taken interest into this as to why in the world don't woodpeckers have more concussions? How can they generate this sheer amount of force to peck into solid wood and not have brain damage? That's one of the key things that has really generated a lot of interest in understanding more about the mechanics of this, because can we use some information from studying woodpeckers to understand and maybe alleviate concussions that result and can reduce brain injury? So let's look at some of these special adaptations that woodpeckers have.
Everyone did, and everyone's got their camera.
And they've studied that this is primarily done by a couple of main researchers at a couple of different institutions, Gibson 2006 and Van Wassenberg et al. 2022. But they found that the reduced relative size and orientation of the brain, so how it sits actually in the skull, as well as its overall smaller size compared to a much larger bird or even to humans, it reduces the risk of concussive brain injury and helps the brain withstand 11 to 20 times greater head and brain acceleration, as well as repeated collision impacts 6 to 7 below brain injury level that we would expect to see in humans if they had also gone through that exact same mechanical process. When they decelerate as they're about ready to peck into wood, as well as the short duration of the impact of the bill into the wood, it reduces intracranial, so within the cranium, within the brain case, pressures by 2 to 3 times. The skull is made of spongy bone, so it's a little more cushioned at both the front and the rear of the skull. And this reduces and resists impact forces without causing any kind of a skull fracture. And then the brain is also tightly packed inside the brain case. And they've actually shown that volume-wise, they have reduced cerebrospinal fluid and an enlarged frontal area. And this minimizes brain motion and reduces stress on the brain compared to a much larger brain. This is a bunch of words. This is a little bit of word salad, and I found a little video, and we've tested this. I'm hoping that the audio comes through okay, but this video really does a great job at kind of taking what I just went through and putting it into some really practical examples.
Woodpeckers peck, drill, and drum on trees to find food, make a home, and communicate with other woodpeckers. In this example, Affiliated woodpecker is seen drilling its characteristic rectangular hole in the pursuit of insects and insect larvae. To start, the woodpecker grabs onto and uses its tail wing to prop itself against the tree. Then its head and neck wind up and its bill quickly rams into the tree, where its head instantaneously stops, known as deceleration. Just like an axe, the rigidity of the bill and skull allow it to chip away at the wood in its pursuit of insect prey. However, the sudden deceleration causes a tremendous force of impact on its head, yet the woodpecker remains uninjured. So why is this? Well, the woodpecker has some incredible evolutionary adaptations and traits to help it stay safe. First, its brain is small. Smaller objects, compared to larger objects, can better withstand the great force caused by the pecking motion. Second, the brain has a comparatively large contact surface area with the front and back of its skull, helping to spread out the force between the brain and the skull. And third, the duration of the force is very short, and the length of time matters when it comes to collisions. In fact, scientific research and math show that the force is significantly below the point where the woodpecker could get a concussion. Ongoing research also demonstrates other important adaptations. The brain is tightly contained within the skull, therefore reducing how much it jostles around. The internal structure of the skull bones is more condensed than other birds, making it stronger and better able to withstand the force of deceleration and pecking. The lower mandible of the bill is longer, allowing it to absorb more of the pecking forces, and more of the forces from the sudden deceleration is transferred down into the body. These are great examples demonstrating how evolution has selected for traits that make woodpeckers so well adapted to pecking. Meanwhile, research continues to investigate and find more data about the adaptive structure and function of woodpeckers.
Just really, really cool. I hope that audio came through okay. Just really, really cool. And if it didn't come through, we're recording this, so you should be able to kind of go back and look at it. But just really, really kind of fascinating to see what we understand about why they can actually tolerate this. So in addition to all that, they've also got some foot and tail adaptations that allow them to go through the process of pecking into wood. They have what is called zygodactyl toe arrangement. With most bird species, there are 4 toes. There can be anywhere from 2 found in ostriches and emus up to 5 in species like mouse birds. But the general number of toes that are found in most bird species is 3 to 4. Woodpeckers also have 4 toes, but instead of having 3 toes pointed towards the front and 1 toe pointed towards the back, like you would expect with the songbird, they actually have their toes formed in almost an X, where you have 2 facing forward and 2 facing to the rear. And this is important because it allows them to attach to the tree, as well as kind of spread their body weight along the tree or the branch that they are going to be pecking on. And that allows them to hold on easily as they are pecking their bill into the side of a trunk. They also have stiff tail feathers, as was kind of mentioned in the video, and those stiff tail feathers help them to brace onto the side of a trunk of a tree, so that, again, they can kind of hold themselves upright as they are trying to peck into that tree. So you can see this red-bellied woodpecker. I'll talk about him in just a bit. He's using those long tail feathers. You can see those pointed ones facing down, but they're being braced against the trunk of the tree to keep him upright. And then you can see that toe spread. You've got the 2 toes facing to the front. 1 toe is facing off down into the left, and then the other toe is down into the right. So they can spread that toe out, or spread those toes out and allow that wide surface area so they can grasp onto the side of the trunk. Really, really cool stuff. They've got some various tongue adaptations, which I thought would be kind of fun to talk about. So woodpeckers are kind of known to have one of the longest relative tongue sizes compared to their overall skull structure. Our tongue as humans is fairly short. It kind of attaches right at the very top of our throat. Their their fleshy part of their tongue actually goes down into the jaw, up and around the back of the head, and then attaches at the base of the bill. You can see that here on the picture on the left. You can see from the top view of the skull here, this kind of pink line that then splits into this Y towards the base of the skull. That's where it attaches. And not only the fleshy part, but you can see when they extend their tongue, this white area on the lower left-hand picture, this is bone. This is called the hyoid horns. And this is the site where the tongue actually attaches to the bony portion. And they can extend that tongue, which if you look in the upper right here, you can see this kind of feathering barbs at the end of their tongue. Makes it really stiff, really rigid, but it's also really sticky. Their saliva is really sticky right towards the tip of the tongue. And so they can probe that tongue into different cavities or holes that they've drilled into sides of trunks or branches. And that stickiness allows them to reach that tongue in and hang on to any type of food that's in there, whether it be a seed, whether it's an insect, or in some cases, it might be nectar. So just really kind of fascinating. Just the length of that tongue is just, it's crazy ridiculous how long that tongue is compared to the overall size of the body. I want to talk a little bit about sexual dimorphism. If you've watched woodpeckers, you know most woodpecker species look a little bit different in terms of identifying males and females. Not all of them, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But sexual dimorphism results from this combination between natural selection, which is environmental selection, whether it be weather, climate, predation, all these different factors can help shape and form what a species looks like, as well as sexual selection. And when we look at sexual selection, there's two different components to it. There's intra-sexual competition. So this is competition within the sexes, males competing with other males, and that can affect how males look. And then intersexual selection. This is sexual selection that goes on between the sexes. So females choosing males based on certain characteristics, or vice versa, males choosing females based on certain characteristics. And there's this push and pull between natural selection and sexual selection that can really kind of help shape and form some of these different phenotypes or different ways that the different species look to each other. So with many woodpeckers, we know that there are intersexual differences in characteristics. In this case, more often than not, how much red is being shown. And for a lot of species, you might know, so we've got this red-bellied woodpecker. I'll talk about this guy in just a bit. Female is on the left. She has a pale gray coloration to her crown. Her nape, or the back of her skull to the back of her neck, is bright red. So this is all feathers. And they grow gray feathers on the crown as well as the forehead. And then they have red feathers on the base of the skull and the nape of the skull. The male's on the right. He's got red feathers all the way from the base of the bill all the way to the nape of the neck. And so those males and females look different, and we can identify those based on how much red is being shown. Males have more red, females have less red, and this is kind of a common trend for a lot of woodpecker species, but not all of them. So this is a red-headed woodpeckers. And to us, at least, these look similar. Now, we don't know what they look like to each other. We do know that bird species in general have very different vision than what we have. They can see an ultraviolet spectrum. They can see much brighter colors than we can, and we can see, they do this, we can understand this based on their anatomy and their physiology and studying these species for a long time. So it's possible that, you know, males and females look different to each other in ways that we can't pick up on based on our limitations as human beings. But at least to us, the male and the female red-headed woodpecker look very similar. So there have to be ways that the males and females can tell each other apart. Then the last thing I want to talk about is with woodpecker species, we know that some species they stay in the same spot throughout the entire year. Some of them migrate, and that might be kind of a surprise to some of you. Yes, there are some woodpecker species that do go through a regular migration. When we look at bird species and whether or not they have evolved this migratory habit, it comes down primarily to two main factors. And we can graph these factors and look at how predictable is their food and how much variation is there from one season to the next in that food availability. And we can keep this kind of simple, and we can say, is food predictability high or is food predictability low? It's on the y-axis, on the vertical axis. We can look at the x-axis. We can also say, is seasonal variation in food availability low or is it high? And when we kind of graph some of these out and we compare species that are go through different migratory habits, we can go and kind of form this little bit of a wheel. And no, there won't be a quiz on this later, I promise. It can look a little intimidating. But when we kind of start to pick this apart, we can look at ways that food predictability and seasonal variation in food availability affect whether or not you are a migratory species. So for species that are resident, like our little downy woodpecker here in the upper left-hand corner, we can see that the food predictability is high. Its food's going to be there all the time, and it knows it's going to be there all the time. We also know that the variation in the food that it eats from season to season is very low. We can tell that because it's on the left-hand side of the x-axis. So for species that are residents, they have high predictability of food, they have low seasonal variation, they know that food's going to be there all the time whenever they expect that they need it, and therefore they can be a resident. They can stay in their same spot year after year after year throughout the entire year annual cycle. In the upper right, we've got what are called obligate annual migrants. These are species that have to migrate year after year after year. So we've got our yellow-bellied sapsucker. We're going to talk about these guys in just a bit. They are annual migrants. They are in this area. They're here typically during the summer, migrate further south during the winter. And talk a little bit about their food. So they have high food predictability. They know that food's going to be there year after year, but it's only going to be there for part of the year. That's why their seasonal variation is quite high. So about 20% of their diet is composed of nectar. And the other 80%, most of it's composed of insects. And so those just aren't found during the winter. You got to leave because you're not going to find the right kind of food when the winter gets bad. Food gets covered up, insects become dormant or maybe die off, and you can't have insects again. The nectar isn't flowing in the plants. You got to move so you can find food that you can eat. We have what are called facultative migrants. These are migrant species that may migrate in a year that's really rough weather-wise, or they might stay put in a year that's very predictable. Here's our red-headed woodpecker in the lower right. They're considered facultative migrants because they might migrate when the oak mast production from the oak trees, the acorn production, is unpredictable. There's just not a lot of food that was produced. You got to move in order to find that food. In years where there's a lot of food production, you might stay put the entire year round. And it can really kind of fluctuate from year to year. And then you've got some species that can be a little bit nomadic. More often than not, these pileated woodpeckers in the lower left, they tend to stay in the same spot year after year after year. But if they live in an area where their food isn't very predictable, their variation in food is also quite low, you might be able to wander and move from spot to spot and find food that you need, set up camp, food gets depleted, you move again, and kind of have this wandering lifestyle for a little bit. We do know that in some species that seasonal predictability of food is high, so they're residents, but they can also be somewhat nomadic if that food variation, the food predictability drops. So really kind of fascinating little way to look at whether you're a migrant or whether you might stay in the same spot year round. And the reality is there's a conundrum of responses, and they might change from one year to the next or over as species kind of evolve. All right, last thing I'm going to talk about before we get into the species of Illinois is you may or may not have heard that woodpeckers, or you can identify woodpeckers based on how often they peck, their pecking cadence, or how many pecks they do per second, per minute. I don't buy it. There are some generalities. So we've got a downy woodpecker up on the top here. These are what are called oscillograms. And as I'm talking to you, my voice is causing waves that you're picking up with your ears. Woodpecker pecking onto the side of a trunk is the same thing. And so there's a downy woodpecker, and you can see the very systematic, very regular rhythmic drumming. You can see the scale on the top here. It's in the matter of tenths of seconds, so it's very, very fast. But you can see it's a very regular cadence. Got a hairy woodpecker on the bottom. Cadence is much more disruptive. It kind of does a peck, and then there's a longer pause, peck, 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 longer pause, peck, 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 long pause, peck, peck, long pause, peck, peck. So in this particular recording, downy woodpecker is being very regular, hairy woodpecker is being a little bit more sporadic. Maybe that could be a diagnostic, but I've also seen a downy woodpecker go from a live tree and is pecking for foraging, and then moves over to a different tree and is pecking maybe to communicate with its partner or to communicate with another male that it doesn't want in its territory, and its pecking cadence will change. The resonance from whether it's a live tree versus a dead tree will change. What's its overall goal? Is it building a cavity? Is it foraging for food? Is it communicating? It can change across species and even within individuals, depending on what the goal of its pecking is actually to be. So just kind of some cool, fascinating stuff about woodpeckers in general. I'm going to go through kind of the woodpeckers that we have here in Illinois. We have 7 woodpeckers that we can find here in central Illinois, and Illinois in general. Used to have 8, and I'll talk about 8, but focus kind of primarily on the 7 that you might expect. So the first is the red-bellied woodpecker. You can see here in Illinois from the map on the left, they are year-round residents. You go a little bit further north up into Wisconsin or out west towards the Dakotas, they might do some facultative migration where they have to migrate if it's a particularly rough winter. But in general, most of these woodpecker species, most of these populations of woodpeckers stay put from year to year. The males have a red that goes all the way to the base of the bill, to the back of the skull. Females on the left-hand picture here, she's got that gray cap and then the red nape. And then, as I kind of said, they're resident. They tend to be woodland generalists, so they are found in open woodlands, deciduous woodlands, areas that are mixed with coniferous and deciduous forests. And the canopy can either be open or it can be closed. They could be found on edges, so this abrupt junction between a forest and an open grassland area. They can be found in clearings, groves, or savannas, as well as in backyards. And you can find these guys at bird feeders throughout the year. And when you look at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, they tend to be increasing kind of throughout their range. So they're doing quite well and being quite stable. A couple fun facts. Males are about 8 to 10% larger on average than females. When you look at the nest height, they nest anywhere from about 50 feet off the ground up to 120 feet. From banding records, the oldest known red-bellied woodpecker was about 12 years and 3 months. This is a banded male in Georgia. And it can drum for 18 to 19 beats per second for up to 1 second at a time. So they tend to drum pretty fast, and then they kind of take a break after they go through their drumming process. Next, we have red-headed woodpeckers. These guys are closely related to red bellies. You can see from their map on the left, that pink area, that's where they're found year-round. So here in Illinois, we tend to have red-headed woodpeckers in the same spot throughout the year. But again, depending on food availability, they might need to move from one spot to the next to find enough food. You go further north in their range to Minnesota, the Dakotas, out to Montana, up to Canada. You can see that they tend to be there just during the breeding season and then migrate further south with the winter. Males and females look similar. They both have these bold black and white patterns on their body, wings, and tail, and then the bright red on the head. These guys are facultative migrants. They're considered sexually monomorphic, so both their plumage as well as their body size is very similar. These guys tend to be more open woodlands as well as savannas that have very large mature trees. And in general, they're actually decreasing throughout their range, primarily because of loss of habitat. You get into open wooded areas, or savanna areas are not as common, especially here in Illinois, compared to what they were historically. And in Illinois, their conservation status is actually they're a species of greatest conservation need. Couple fun facts about red-headed woodpeckers. They're one of four woodpecker species that are known to cache food. So if you think back to that acorn woodpecker, they were storing those acorns into the trunk of the tree. These guys will do that as well. They're one of the older woodpecker species. There's fossils from the Pleistocene, up to 2 million years old, found in Florida, Virginia, and also here in Illinois. The oldest banded red-headed woodpecker was just under 10 years old. And I should say with these banding records, it doesn't mean the bird died right after that, right? I mean, that makes sense. It just means that the oldest that one has been banded and then recovered later is roughly about this time frame. They could have lived for 5, 10 more years after that, just never been caught again to be identified based on their leg bands. They can drum 19 to 25 beats per second in 1 second bursts, and they tend to repeat these bursts or these cadences up to 2 to 3 times. Next, we have our downy woodpecker. These guys are probably the most common woodpecker that we have here in Illinois, as well as kind of throughout North America. They're going to look really similar to the hairy woodpecker, which I'll talk about next after that. But we'll talk about some of the differences you can use to identify the downy and the hairy from each other. These guys tend to be residents, so they tend to stay in the same spot year after year. They're kind of considered a woodland generalist, so you get them in deciduous forests. They can be an open or closed canopy. They're found in mixed coniferous or deciduous forest, and you can see, you remember the range, they went from Alaska all the way down towards Florida, as well as northern Mexico. So they're quite a wide distribution, and it helps to be able to flex with those different habitat types. You get them in edges, you get them in clearings, groves, very common feeder birds, and they're considered to be stable throughout their range. And so you can see the male is on the left. He's got that red spot at the back of his skull. Female's on the right, and hers is all black and white. She doesn't have that red spot. Couple fun facts. It takes a pair of downy woodpeckers anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks to excavate a new nest cavity before laying eggs. They might use the same cavity from year to year. Just depends on maybe how successful they were or how much food is available. But if they need to excavate a new cavity, it takes them 1 to 3 weeks. Males and females are similar in size and weight, but females have actually been measured to have slightly longer tails. Interesting. The oldest known downy woodpecker was almost 12 years old. It was banded in California. And they can drum for 16 to 17 beats per second in bouts of 1/4 of a second long up to almost 2 seconds long. Here's our hairy woodpecker. You can see they've got a similar range. They look similar. These guys do extend down into Mexico, as well as some birds can be over into the West Indies there. So they do have a slightly wider range compared to the downy woodpecker. But in general, they're not nearly as common as downy woodpeckers are. And at Adams Wildlife Sanctuary, we tend to see more downy woodpeckers than we do hairy, although we do have both species utilizing the property. With hairy woodpeckers, they're also residents, same as the downy. They tend to like a little bit more mature deciduous forest and have a little bit larger trees, which would come with that maturation of the forest tree species found there. They also will use mixed coniferous and deciduous forests. They also like swampy areas in the more southern parts of their range. They're found in groves, they're found in backyards, also common at bird feeders. And these guys are actually increasing throughout their range compared to what they were historically. Now, what that might mean is that, you know, as part of their range maybe went through a clear cut or a reduction in tree species or larger trees, and then was replanted through human means, or the forest was allowed to kind of grow back. As those trees are maturing, we're seeing hairy woodpeckers back in areas that they maybe would have been historically, but had to abandon because of tree loss or habitat loss, that kind of thing. Similar to a downy woodpecker, you can see males on the left. They have the red spot at the back of their head. Females on the right, they have white and black, but no red. Some fun facts about hairy woodpeckers. During courtship, paired males and females will actually drum in duet. So they might be perched near each other, maybe on the same tree, and they will actually pound into the side of the trunk or the branch together to show that strength of their courtship. Sometimes they're nectivorous. They actually will drink from foraging cavities after yellow-bellied sapsuckers, so a species I haven't talked about quite yet. But after they drill their holes and abandon the area, they might go after that sap. They also have been shown to drill into sugarcane in a more southern portion of their range. Oldest known hairy woodpecker was about 16 years old, was banded in New York. And they can drum anywhere from 25 beats per second with really long pauses in between their drumming bouts. When we compare a hairy and a downy, you can see there's a downy on the left-hand side of the picture. Hairy is on the right-hand side of the picture. The downy has a very short, stubby bill, is one thing. And you can see that if you were to fold that bill, if you imagine it's on a hinge at its base, if you fold that bill, it might reach to the back of the eye. The hairy is on the right. You can see it's got a proportionally much longer bill. So if you imagine that hinge is at the base of the bill, you fold that back, it's going to reach very close to the back of the head. So proportionally, females are downies have a very short stubby bill. Hairies have a much longer, a little bit more of a stout bill. And you might say, well, duh, downies are much smaller, hairies are much bigger. It's not always the best comparison. You can get large downies or small hairies, and they can be side by side, very similar in overall body size, but those downies still have that short stubby bill, and the hairies have that longer, stouter bill. And they don't really understand exactly why they look so similar to each other. Historically, they thought that downies and hairies were much more similar genetically, and they are. They have the same genus. But in terms of the overall group of woodpecker species that have that same genus, they're not as close a sister taxa as they thought they were originally. And so there's a hypothesis out there now that actually downy woodpeckers might be mimicking hairy woodpeckers, maybe similar to that viceroy monarch kind of mimicry, even though we know that viceroys and monarchs both now are poisonous. By looking like your somewhat larger cousin, even if it's a distant cousin, you might be able to have an advantage with species that you might be competing with for similar food types. So by looking similar, you might be able to kind of exaggerate how aggressive or how large you actually are compared to other species, and that can make you competitive for food, for resources, for cavities, for nesting, all that kind of stuff. Our fifth species is the yellow-bellied sapsucker. These guys are found primarily in Illinois during migration in the northern half of the state, southern half of the state. They might be found during the winter, but they don't tend to breed here. There are a couple of small breeding kind of pockets found in the state, but they're not I wouldn't consider them to be a regular or a common breeder. Breeding much further north up into Canada, Wisconsin, Michigan, those are kind of the lower latitudes. They do get into some parts of the lower Appalachians. And then wintering range, you get to south of here, and they tend to be there during the winter. When we're at Adams, I tend to get them just during migration, both during spring as well as during fall. Okay, there we go. They're considered to be an obligate migrant, so they have to migrate year after year. And as I kind of mentioned, about 20% of their diet is made of nectar, and the other 80% is made up of invertebrates, insects, arthropods, all that kind of stuff. So those are food sources that are not found very commonly during the wintertime. And so you got to move in order to find those foods that you prefer. Habitat-wise, in breeding areas, they tend to like younger forests, so those early successional stages of tree regrowth. They're very somewhat common in regenerating timber stands, groves of small trees where sap is easily accessible. During the winter, they like bottomland hardwood forests. They like orchards, palm groves, scrub, a variety of different habitats. And they're actually decreasing throughout their range, but here in Illinois, they are somewhat stable. And unlike most woodpecker species, you can see the male on the left here, female on the right. They both have red on the crown, but here the male has a red throat and the female has a white throat. You might say, well, in this particular case, the male is much more yellow on the breast, female is much more white. This is just the case of the individuals in the pictures. Males and females both have a yellow buffy wash. Sometimes they have a white wash. It really just kind of depends. What is really cool, you can find yellow-bellied sapsuckers, or how you know you have yellow-bellied sapsuckers, is they are very systematic in how they locate and drill for sap in the trees. And so you can see they are very regimented in doing holes that are very vertically oriented and very regularly spaced between. So if you start to see, very regular squares or drilled lines that go straight up and down, really good chance that yellow-bellied sapsucker is in your neighborhood. Couple fun facts. They may tap at more than 1,000 different species of trees or woody plants. They do prefer birch and maple trees, which tend to have a higher sap content that moves through the trunks of their trees. Their migration routes and lengths are not very well studied. We do know areas where they are found on migration, where they spend the breeding season as well as the winter. But how individuals, say you plucked an individual from Wisconsin, you may or may not know whether it's going to migrate through Illinois on its way down to Louisiana, or maybe it goes to Florida. So really some good potential for trying to study some of these different things that we just don't know a whole lot about with yellow-bellied sapsuckers. The oldest known yellow-bellied sapsucker was just less than 8 years old. It was banded in New Jersey and then recaptured in South Carolina. And their drumming is much slower and more irregular than other woodpecker species. All right. The next to last one that we currently have here in Illinois is the northern flicker. We tend to have these guys year-round in Illinois. You can see that we're very pink on the map. Further north you go, up into Canada as well as Alaska, they spend the breeding season there and then migrate out. And then in portions of Southern California, southern Texas, and northern Mexico, they are there just for the winter. Very interesting type of distribution for their range map. These are also called yellow-shafted flickers, or yellow-shafted race of the northern flicker. I'll talk a little bit about that and what the genetics tells us in just a bit. These guys are considered facultative migrants kind of throughout their range. As I mentioned, here in Illinois, they do tend to be here year-round. But what we don't know, we don't have very good information from banding records, is whether the individuals we see here during the breeding season are the same individuals that we see here during the winter. We just don't have enough information. So it's possible individuals that breed here move further south. Individuals that breed further north, up in Wisconsin or in Canada, actually winter down here. We need a lot more information to actually tease that apart. Habitat-wise, these guys are what you would consider forest edges or open woodlands, and they will use savanna areas. They tend to like much more open habitat compared to other woodpecker species. They tend to avoid dense closed forests, and they require open ground for foraging. So will see these guys foraging on ants or other insects on the ground, as well as pecking into the sides of trees. They are decreasing throughout their range, and here in Illinois, they are considered a species of the greatest conservation need. Males and females look very, very similar. Males on the top picture, females on the lower picture. And they don't have differences in the amount of red that they have, but you can see males have that, look at that luxurious mustache, that nice black line coming out the base of the bill. That's a male. He's got the mustache. Females on the bottom. She does not have the mustache. So you can tell those apart that way. Couple fun facts: they prefer to forage on the ground in open areas. They typically are tree cavity nesters, so they do excavate cavities into live or dead or dying trees. But they've also been found nesting in old earthen burrows that have been vacated by species like belted kingfishers or bank swallows, and they will take those small bank swallow holes and widen them out. The oldest known northern flicker was just over 9 years old, and it was abandoned in Florida. And they can drum up to 25 beats per second for up to a second long. And because I'm a bit of a genetics nerd, as Marilyn kind of mentioned in my introduction, there's been a lot of cool research into these northern flickers. If you look at older field guides, you might see a separate entry for yellow-shafted flicker and red-shafted flicker. Currently, they're all under the umbrella of the species, the northern flicker, and they keep going back and forth as to, are they a separate species or are they not? And so some genetic work that's been done includes yellow-shafted race of the northern flicker. The red-shafted race, which you can see in the map in the lower right, is much further west. You get onto the west coast or down into Mexico. That's where you get the red-shafted flicker. You can see from the pictures on the top, they're yellow-shafted there. It's got that little black mustache. Red-shafted flicker, aside from having red on the underside of the wings and the tail, has a red mustache. And then there is a gilded flicker, which is in the purple range. It's found in the southwest US, as well as in Mexico, west coast of Mexico. They have a kind of a golden crown as well as the red mustache. So they ran some genetics just to kind of understand what's the inbreeding like, what do they interbreed with each other, what's going on. And so on these little graphs on the left side, the purple is the gilded flicker. That's the matches their range map, and on the right hand side, red dots are for red-shafted flicker and yellow are for yellow-shafted flicker. So the individuals that they identified as those species are identified by those colored dots. And yellow-shafted flickers tend to group more together. Red-shafted flickers tend to group more together. And the purple, the gilded woodpeckers, tended to group more together. And you can look at these bar charts on the bottom, and what's really interesting is if you look at this lower graph, the purple are the gilded, so most of the individuals that they tested tended to have gilded woodpecker DNA. But there's a little bit of red-shafted in there. Those red bars are creeping up on some of those individuals. Red-shafted flickers in the middle tended to have mostly red-shafted, but some had yellow-shafted. You can see those yellow bars on those two individuals kind of creeping in. And the individual on the right has gilded flicker DNA, yellow-shafted DNA, and red-shafted DNA. So there is some hybridization that goes on. And then the yellow-shafted that they tested, primarily yellow-shafted DNA, but a little bit of red. Just really, I really geek out over this stuff. It's just really, really, really cool. And then another study that was done looked at the different migration patterns as well as hybridization that goes on. And they found that red-shafted and yellow-shafted northern flickers only differ by 1/100% of their DNA. That's it. But that 1.01% difference allows for the red coloration on the wings and the tail, and the red coloration in the mustache for the red-shafted compared to the yellow-shafted, which had the black mustache and the yellow on the wings and tail. 386 different markers compared to the billions and billions of markers in their DNA. That's it. And it's a big enough difference to cause that coloration difference. Just really, really cool stuff. I can't get over it. It's really, really neat. All right. The last current woodpecker species we have here in Illinois is the pileated woodpecker. This is our largest woodpecker species. So this is a little bit of an older map. You can see here in Illinois, we've got this big gray gaping hole. You're like, well, there's pileated woodpeckers in Springfield. Well, yeah, there are. We get them at Adams every once in a while. So I was like, well, maybe this is just an old map. So I brought up the eBird data, which tends to be pretty current. And you look, and there's still kind of this little bit of a hole. You can see that there are some here in central Illinois. This purple is creeping in again, but there are gaps in the state where there still are not pileated woodpeckers. Well, why is that the case? Well, these guys tend to be residents. Sometimes they're nomadic. They really like mature forests with dead trees that are large and have a lot of decaying wood. And what's interesting is that they're actually increasing throughout their range. But the reason that they're increasing is in the late 1800s, they were actually declined quite precipitously because old growth forests were still being harvested. In the 1920s, we started to see this rebound because as trees were planted to replace those old growth forests, they weren't the same trees, but as they've gotten older and they've started to mature into the second growth forest, now we're starting to see them come back to areas that they were historically. So this accounts for this increase, especially here in Illinois. And so they are filling in that gap in central and north central Illinois, where historically they likely were found. And then they're starting to bounce back as the trees have actually matured. A couple fun facts: males are 10 to 15% heavier than females. Historically, they think home ranges, so the areas that pairs would have used in order for breeding, may have been upwards of 300 to 900 acres, which is quite large for such a medium-sized overall bird. Currently, pairs use about 150 acres. And then there was one pair on Staten Island that only had 70 acres for its home range. So they can flex and they can use less than those original estimates. But in optimal habitat, they might actually try and sequester more territory for that particular breeding pair. The oldest known pileated woodpecker was about 13 years old and was banded in Maryland. And they can drum up to 14 beats per second for nearly 2 seconds long. All right, the last one I'm going to talk about is the ivory-billed. You can see from the map, historically, they were found in the very, very southern reaches of southern Illinois. The Shawnee National Forest area, those old growth timber forests, that was the northern extent of where ivory-billed woodpeckers would have ranged. It's the largest woodpecker that we did have in North America. And it was also known as the Lord God bird, because when people would see these guys flying through the air, they were so big, people would say, "Oh my Lord God, what is that bird?" And it's just amazing when you see some of these old pictures of the overall size of these woodpeckers flying through the air. They liked very large contiguous tracts of open forest with very large mature trees. And then they would also forage in upland pine forests, again, that were very mature, had large mature trees present in them. And most of these pictures that I'm kind of showing were actually from the 1930s. Ivory-billed woodpeckers in Louisiana, excavating nesting cavities and utilizing some of these large trees that I've been talking about. The habitat that they used succumbed to extensive logging. You can see up in the very northern map, or the very top map here, the black area is all what's considered old growth, virgin, extensive forests. In 170 years, you can see how much of it was cut down for utilization by humans, primarily east of the Mississippi River, or at least east of the Great Plains. And then by the 1920s, you can see huge chunks of it are gone. And so each dot that you can see in this peppered map, especially at the bottom, represents 25,000 acres. So you can see how much old growth forest we had throughout the eastern half of the US. And then 300 years later, how much of it was gone through extensive logging. It's just crazy. By the 1890s, ivory bills were restricted to bottomland swamps that also contained bald cypress. And then they would use recently flooded or burned stands of pine forests that had gone through some sort of a disturbance in order to forage. The question on your mind is, or maybe on your minds, is it extinct? Well, you may have heard almost 20, or well, I should say before I get into that, the last confirmed sightings in the US were in 1944. In Cuba, there were confirmed sightings into the mid-1980s. And you may have heard that about 20 years ago, there were recordings potentially from eastern Arkansas. And these guys have a pretty distinct sound, but what people thought they might have actually been hearing is ivory-billed woodpeckers have a very distinct tapping cadence. They tend to double tap on the side of the tree. So they would go tap, tap, and really long pause, tap, tap, primarily when they're communicating with each other. And so there was enough circumstantial evidence that in 2006, Cornell, which is kind of the quintessential lab of ornithology, they started searching, and for about 5 years, they searched over 500,000 acres throughout 8 states in the Southeast US, primarily focusing on Arkansas, Florida, and Louisiana. There were multiple recordings done. They couldn't confirm a population. The old growth forest destruction was still an issue. They don't have the huge extensive tracts of forests that they still needed. And in 2021, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually recommended listing it from critically endangered to extinction. A couple other woodpecker species that have been found in Illinois. Lewis's woodpecker is a western species. You get those guys in the Dakotas out towards the western coast. There was one in Effingham, seen in 2019. Red cockaded woodpeckers, they're typically found southeast of us in the old growth forests from Louisiana up to the Carolinas. There's one at Illinois Beach State Park in 2000. Blackback woodpeckers, they tend to be further north towards Wisconsin, the UP, up into Canada. There was one at Thorn Creek Wildlife Area in Chicago in the 1980s, and a Williamson sapsucker in Chicago in the mid-80s. These guys are also a West Coast species. But that's a majority of the woodpeckers that we see here in Illinois. I briefly want to talk about some of their conservation. Some of the big issues that woodpeckers are facing in current days and age. And you can see when I was talking about the ones we have here in Illinois, most of them are stable. Most of them are at least holding their own, if not increasing. But there are a couple species that are facing some decreases, especially northern flickers and red-headed woodpeckers. Some of the things include things like pesticides. So neonicotinoids are a big hot topic right now. They take out a lot of insects on purpose or through accidental bycatch. Woodpeckers eat a lot of insects, and you can get these buildup inside their bodies, and it can be toxic to woodpecker species. So their food and their availability of food is definitely an issue. Habitat loss is definitely something that is a concern. They utilize dead and dying trees, and a lot of promotion for forest health still considers removing dead and dying trees from wooded areas to keep the forest healthy, even though we know that a healthy forest doesn't necessarily only have living trees in it. And then the last thing, of course, is that overarching climate change. You get hot, drier summers, you get a change in fire frequency. This, as well as fire intensity, this definitely affects forest growth, forest development, and you lose a lot of those dead, dying trees they get turned to carbon, basically, through ash, and woodpeckers don't necessarily have as much habitat available that they would have had in the past. All right, that's all I got. Thank you guys for your attention, and I'll take any questions. I don't see any in the chat right now, but if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Got a question here from my gallery. It says, I'm interested in the question of instinct. Do you have an opinion as to how woodpeckers know how to excavate a cavity in a tree? I'm amazed at how birds build their nests and wonder if what instructions they are following when they do the building. And I assume this is a question involving genetics. I think you're right on target. Something likely is in their hard wiring about how to excavate a proper cavity. We do know that some woodpecker species have maybe a year between when they leave their parents' cavity and when they actually start to nest on their own. So that year could allow them to learn. A lot of other species also may stay on as helpers. So you might help your parents raise future generations for a year or two before you set out on your own. So some of those woodpeckers might go through a learning period as well. But I think you're probably right. Most of the woodpecker species that I understand, once you leave and fledge from your parents' nest, you tend to be on your own. So I think there likely is a lot of instinct. Something in their hard wiring has been built into their overall genetic makeup that allows them to know what they need. Some woodpecker species, especially females of woodpecker species, will inspect a hole or a cavity that a male digs out. So there could be some learning there, and it takes them a little bit to actually get it right. There's probably a full spectrum in terms of how much is learned versus how much is instinctual. So it's a really great question. There's a question here, which species cache food besides red-headed? I know the acorn woodpecker, that one I showed earlier on, will also cache food. I admit I should have looked at the other two. That was one of my things I was going to do before I gave this talk, and I actually don't know off the top of my head. I might be able to do some searching, and I'll see if I can tease that out. Beth, I have your contact information here, and I can try and maybe send that information to you. She also has there's no naive questions, but does backyard bird feeding ever mess up facultative migration? That's a great question. We get that a lot. I did a post on the website. Joe put it up for me several weeks ago. Does bird feeding affect migration? To the best of our knowledge, from everything that we can tell, it doesn't. There's a lot that goes into what causes a bird to migrate. So those that are facultative, food availability definitely can be a driver. But remember, there's cold weather and temperature. There's available water. So I studied sandhill cranes for a really long time. They can withstand temperatures to 30 below zero. They migrate up to Alaska in March. They're like, this is whatever, I don't care. As long as they can find food, they're going to be fine. But if there's no open water, then that can kill you faster than just about anything. So if there's available water, then those facultative migrants can potentially weather it out if there's also potentially available food. So to the best of our knowledge, bird feeding doesn't affect migration for facultative migrants. It doesn't affect hummingbirds because there's a lot of cues that they respond to in order to make that choice of whether they're going to migrate or not. I've got Susan here saying, when say pecking is communication, what are they communicating? That's a good question. So woodpeckers peck for a variety of reasons. That there might be excavating a cavity. They might be drilling out to find foraging. They might be doing a lot of different things. They might be communicating maybe with their partner, saying, hey, I'm over here. I'm foraging for food right now. They might be communicating with the species or the same sex of the same species hey, this is my territory. You really don't want to come over here because I'm big and tough and I'm going to chase you out of here. If they don't have a mate, they might be communicating, hey, this is my territory. I've got a really great spot. There's a lot of food. I've dug out a nice cavity. Come on over and check it out. So there's probably a variety of different things. It depends on what they're trying to convey in terms of information. All right, looks like those are the questions that were put into the chat. Okay, Marilyn, I'll turn it back over to you and let you close things out.